distinguished guests, fellow philosophers, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very honored to have this rare opportunity to address the complex idea of a dialogical civilization for the 21st century. Since 2001, the year of the dialogue among civilizations, I've been very actively engaged in thinking about philosophy in the dialogue of cultures. A brief description is in order. Unlike economic globalization, cultural globalization enhances cultural diversity. Virtually all primordial ties, such as ethnicity, gender, language, age, place of birth, status, and faith, religion, emerge as powerful social and political forces demanding attention. I don't have to go through the specific issues. Identity politics is absolutely critical in understanding the two sides of the straits in Taiwan. Language is absolutely important even for the United States, because despite English, the United States is very worried about Spanish in California, in Texas, in Florida. To avoid explosive conflicts and tensions, dialogue at all levels, civilizational, regional, natural, and local, are extremely important and necessary. The American unilateralism, which did not work, and of course now wisely replaced by dialogical mode. Whether or not it is merely strategic, it is a clear indication of a significant change. Derrida helped UNESCO to deal with cultural diversity, and I was privileged to address the executive board of UNESCO to share my ideas about the theory and practice of the dialogue among civilizations in 2004. Cultural diversity leads to the thesis, which is widely debated, which I would simply refer to as multiple modernities, not simply multifaceted modernity. This is presented and predicated on two assumptions. One is the continuous presence of traditions in modernity. The other one is modernizing process can assume different cultural forms. Of course, this is another matter. For those of us who are involved in the dialogue, we agree that the golden rule of the dialogue should be stated in the negative. Do not do unto others what you would not want others to do unto you. This is the golden rule in Confucianism and Judaism. This is much more congenial to dialogue than the golden rule stated in the positive. Do unto others what you will want others to do unto you. I will spare you the relevant ethical argument. Suffice it to say, the virtue of reciprocity or considerateness toward the other must first be assured and assumed before the positive golden rule can be applied. In other words, we need to observe the reciprocity of not imposing what we consider to be absolutely critical and meaningful to another as a precondition for establishing the principle of humanity by extending what we think great to others. Not only do unto others what we like others to do unto you, but also, in order to establish myself, I ought to establish others, and in order to enlarge myself, I ought to enlarge others. Dialogue begins with tolerance. It's a minimum condition, but extremely difficult to attain. Tolerance is only the first step. It has to be moved to a stage of recognition, recognizing the integrity of the other. And also to develop a sense of respect, the respect for the whole person, respect for otherness. And only with tolerance, recognition, and respect will we be able to develop a sense of mutual reference. Only with mutual reference will we be involved in mutual learning. If we can involve ourselves in mutual learning, there is the possibility of the celebration of otherness. You can even say the liberating experience of confronting radical otherness, to borrow a phrase from Clifford Geertz. The purpose of dialogue in this connection, first of all, is not to be involved in any conversion. No matter how noble the desire is to share one's good news. This is the reason that the golden rule stated in the negative is absolutely critical. It also shouldn't be an occasion for making a pronouncement, making a statement about what one believes, about what one considers to be essential and important for all humanity. It is not even the occasion to correct misunderstanding of our own position, of our own commitment, of our own faith. What is the purpose then? First of all, it is an occasion to cultivate the art of listening. Of course, this is extremely difficult for philosophers. We are all seasoned in argumentation, in persuasion. Difficult to cultivate the art of listening. But it's also a great occasion for broadening our horizons, extending our horizons in such a way that normally we're not even aware those possibilities. And finally, also to deepen our self-reflexivity. The more we are aware what we know is not necessarily what is the best, what is true. And to know what we do not know. And to know that our knowledge extends, at the same time, our ignorance also expands. In this sense, the implications of the dialogical civilization, or the importance for the dialogue among civilizations, for the Enlightenment project, for Enlightenment mentality in particular, are really far-reaching. Max Weber's idea of modernization as rationalization is very persuasive. It is perhaps arguably one of the most powerful ideologies in human history. Market economy, democratic polity, civil society, not to mention science, technology, of course, modern universities, bureaucracies, are all outcomes of this Enlightenment process understood as a process of modernization. More important for us, philosophers, are the basic values underlying the Enlightenment, such as rationality, liberty, legality, due process of law, rights, human rights in particular, and of course, the dignity of the individual. These are now considered not only by scholars in the West, but all over the world as universal values. But the danger of universal values to become abstract universalism is always there. We need to be mindful of that particular situation. Let me give one illustration. The so-called economic man actually embodies many of these great values. Let me try to give a very brief definition of an economic man. It's a rational animal who's critically aware of his self-interest. That's the meaning of being rational. And who wants to maximize his profit in the relatively free market adjudicated by law. Such a person exhibits rationality, freedom, especially his own freedom, law. He does abide by law, and of course rights, his ability to maximize his profit, not to mention individualism. It's worth noting that Adam Smith, the father of economics in the modern times, really believed that the most important work is moral sentiments. So he considered himself a moral philosopher, and he really personally didn't pay much attention to the wealth of nations. Obviously, some other values essential for human flourishing for the 21st century are absent in the idea of the economic man, and by implication, some of the great ideas of the Enlightenment, such as justice. Of course, in the Islamic world, how important that is. John Rawls' timely, important, and significant attention to this important dimension of human experience is greatly celebrated as a correction to many of the claims in political philosophy. Sympathy and compassion, absent in the economic man, not greatly discussed in the Enlightenment project. It's absolutely critical for understanding sympathy to appreciate Confucianism, or compassion to understand Buddhism. And of course, civility. The debate in China between Li and Fa, civility and law. And of course, responsibility and harmonious society. Often, we characterize these as Asian values, but they're not just Asian values, they're also universal values. At least they ought to be universalized, and of course, they are universalizable. We can say these values are rooted in countries in Asia, but they have become globally significant. They are part of a globally significant local knowledge, comparable to some of the great universal values we're talking about. Many of them are significantly globalized or globally significant values, even though historically or genetically they're rooted in the West. Any proposal for realizing a dialogical civilization ought to take very seriously the dialogue among basic values in different cultures. This is not only desirable, but necessary. We're familiar with the dialogues or conflicts between liberty and equality or justice, or rights and responsibility, sometimes efficiency and social solidarity. But more challenging is to discuss the relationship, the conflict and tension, the possible resolution between rationality and sympathy or compassion, legality and civility, self-realization and social service, or individual dignity and social harmony. You know, Richard Rorty struggled with the last question throughout his life. The challenge is immensely important for philosophy, especially for us committed to the rational discourse. To broaden and deepen our understanding of rationality, to incorporate a variety of rationalities, whether rationalities are allowable or not in philosophy, I think may be controversial, in our communal and critical self-consciousness is a major challenge. In light of the critical spirit in the last few decades, especially in the West, but all over the world, in the form of feminism, environmentalism, religious pluralism, and of course, cultural diversity. We need to rethink the suitability or the feasibility of a kind of secular humanism, a manifestation of the Enlightenment mentality, if not the Enlightenment project. It is important for us to move beyond secular humanism, to go beyond anthropocentrism as embodied in secular humanism. The task of philosophical anthropology is not simply to focus our attention on the anthropological realm of the human, by fixing the relationships between the self and society, or narrowly defined in anthropological terms, or the anthropological world. the Confucian idea of 家国天下, the family, community, nation, and the world. But from the Confucian humanistic point of view, as Professor Balasubramanian, an eminent Indian philosopher, notes, it is not secular humanism, but spiritual humanism. Two dimensions of the human experience and human self-understanding are necessary for understanding the human. They are absent in the original formulation of the Enlightenment. One is heaven, the other is earth. Heaven is, of course, the generic term for many important concepts like Allah, God, Brahman, and so forth. The other is earth. Earth, to use a common expression in sinology, the earth is secular but as sacred. The earth is not secular as opposed to the sacred. To care for the earth is an absolutely critical issue for the human community as a whole. In 1968, for the first time, the human naked eye, with the help of the astronaut, was able to see for the first time the earth in its entirety. Minerals, water, soil, now even air, each one of them is vulnerable. We need to move beyond this limited and limiting idea of regarding nature as a collection of objects. We need to consider them as communion of subjects, as Thomas Berry has stated. This is not at all a romantic assertion about the unity or harmony between the person and the world. This is a realistic, scientifically important idea of human survival, recognizing the earth as our proper home. Heaven is another part of the important human experience. Normally, we talked about it as a form of spirituality. Again, take one particular example I'm familiar with, the Confucian example. Heaven is omnipresent and omniscient, and most likely not omnipotent. Because the advent of the human requires the human responsibility to realize and enlarge not only the human project, but the meaning of heaven. Human beings are observers, to be sure, appreciators aesthetically of nature, but also participants in the cosmic transformation. They can even be called, of course, some religious tradition would not allow, co-creators. Precisely because of the power of the human as co-creators, they can also become major destroyers. Human can survive all natural calamities, according to Chinese historical argument, even before Confucius. The only disaster that human beings cannot survive is man-made. It is in this sense we can envision, which is again not romantic, the human as a mediating structure between heaven and earth, between spirituality on the one hand and earth as the secular but sacred. The dialogue of cultures should be extended beyond the anthropological realm. Human beings are not denatured and dispirited. The comprehensive humanism is both naturalistic and spiritual. This involves at least 4 dimensions. This is my conclusion. At least 4 dimensions of human experience and human self-understanding. The self, especially the true self, in the Hindu sense, the Atman. In the Chinese sense, the Zhenwo, which involves not only the body and mind, but also soul and spirit. The body is never conceived as the prison house of the soul. It is to be cherished, to be respected. The community is not a contractual being. Community is a fiduciary community with its own history, its own evolution, its own demands, its own responsibilities. And earth, since it's secular and sacred, is the common home for us all. Some people use the word lifeboat. But heaven is creativity in itself. So the human project, much broader than the Enlightenment project to fix the relationship between the person as an individual and community or nation. The humanistic concern will have to begin with the integration of the self, care for the self, self-cultivation, but also fruitful interaction between itself and community. Community variously understood, from the family to the world and even to the community of the living and beyond. And the third, sustainable and harmonious relationship between human species, not human individuals, and nature. And mutual responsiveness or mutuality between the human heart and mind and heaven. In this context, the possibility of a naturalistic and spiritual turn in philosophy is, in my view, emerging. Whether or not it is as important or significant as the epistemological turn or the linguistic turn, only time can tell. Just give you one indication. Within the elite universities in the West, or in the Western Academy, we have some of the most brilliant philosophers that begin to think in this way. Look at Charles Taylor, his recent book on the secular age. He's deeply rooted his own tradition, that's Catholicism. He's thinking not only in terms of the anthropological project, but in terms of heaven, in terms of earth. Derrida, to the end of his life, became very much concerned about pardon, which is a Jewish idea, and his return to its Jewish source. Of course, the famous case, Pierre Hadot, in his Philosophy as a Way of Life, Spiritual Exercises from Socrates to Michel Foucault. Actually, I'm sorry that Professor Habermas changed his topic. In his original topic, religion was part of it. And of course, he gave a marvelous presentation on human rights and personal dignity. And in fact, Hadot's whole discussion of spiritual exercises, as I'm absolutely sure about that, profoundly influenced one of the great mathematical logicians, that's Hilary Putnam. Hilary Putnam, before he retired from Harvard, continued to address the four major Jewish thinkers: Maimonides, Rosenzweig, Martin Buber, and Levinas. And he became interested in what he called non-scientific knowledge, despite his commitment to realism, or realism with the human face of the soft realism. With this realization of the naturalistic and spiritual dimensions of humanism, in what sense it can become an integral part of our self-reflection and philosophical inquiry. I have to remind you, for the first time in the history of the Congress philosophy, which established in 1900, it was held in Seoul last year. I think for the first time also, the World Congress began to look at some of the great traditions in human history, such as Buddhism, Taoism, Confucianism, of course, Judaism, Christianity, and so forth. The rational discourse, even in epistemology, if not in logic, can really benefit from the broader vision of not only human survival, but human flourishing. In other words, by embracing not only knowledge, but also wisdom and spirituality, rationality would take a new shape of meaning, even though this new shape of meaning may have a great deal of fruitful ambiguities. I would like to end with a suggestion that the philosophical dialogues should be involved in our ability to dialogue with axial age civilizations, notably Hinduism, Buddhism in South Asia, Confucianism and Taoism in China, and Judaism, Christianity, and Islam in the Middle East. And this way of doing philosophy, of course, among many other very legitimate ways of doing philosophy, I hope will enable the philosophical enterprise to be truly ecumenical. Thank you.
Спасибо, профессор Weiming Tu, за ваш замечательный доклад.